and just dear guest, specifically for our Siberian Studies program, and of course, as a part of our Russian Studies workshop here, supported by Carnegie Corporation of New York at Indiana University, Angelina Davidova from St. Petersburg University in Russia, and now this semester she's a visiting fellow at University of California, Davis, as a Hampton Fellow. Angelina is a very well-known environmental journalist and a curator of environmental projects about water resources through Russia, China, and Kazakhstan. That's online media project. So if you're interested, we can provide a link to this media project as well. So as I mentioned, Angelina, this semester she's a fellow, Humphrey Fellow at the University of California, Davis, and she was a fellow in Reuters Institute for the study of journalism. She was a fellow at Oxford University also, and she's also a head now of the German-Russian Office of Environmental Information. And since 2008, Angelina has been an observer of the UN climate negotiation process, and she quite regularly publishes works on environmental issues in Russian and in English. So please welcome Angelina Davidova.
Thank you, Tatiana, so much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I will start by saying that it's a great honor for me to be speaking here this Friday morning, very sunny, very frosty, back in Russia.
Welcome to Midwest.
And at first I would like to really thank the university for bringing me here and the program, and I would like to thank Sarah Phillips for organizing it all. And I would also like to thank Dean Lozo and Andreas Stanislav, who's join us a bit later, for introducing me to the university and for bringing me to Bloomington, Indiana for the first time. So thank you. Right. Sorry. Sarah, what do I press for the screen to turn? Yeah.
Lisa.
What happened?
Is it? I get so busy.
Did the PowerPoint?
No, it's like I need to have
I
it
don't
on
think
the
it's
screen.
connecting to this. Do you have it yet? I think we got so busy talking.
What's that?
It's not connecting. Oh, was it?
What's not connecting?
Yeah, well, like it's not coming out on the screen because I'm doing something here and it's not on the screen. That isn't showing up on here.
Oh, that I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two screens. We might have to drag them out to the second screen.
And how do I do it with this? I need all of it. Oh yeah, it's coming here. Okay, but will I be able to just hear it?
No, so you're working on a full screen, so there'll be two different.
All right. Okay, so I'll
do you
just
have
have to. No, I need the. Wait a minute. I need the crazy. Okay, I'll start with this. Then I'll work it out. Okay, sorry about it. Right. So for the next hour and a half, I'm going to be telling you about environmental challenges in today's Russia. I'm also going to be telling you about environmental policies that Russian government is currently undertaking in order to tackle these challenges. And I'm also going to be telling you about civil society in Russia and that part of civil society which deals with environmental challenges, including the new grassroots green groups which are appearing all over the country, including vast regions of Siberia. I understand there are quite a few people in this audience who are particularly interested in Siberian studies, so I'll try to emphasize it as much as I can. Right, so you have to get used to it. Some of the materials, some of the visual information I'm going to be showing you here will unfortunately be in Russian because it was only available in Russian. So just to cross-check, how many people here in the audience can read Russian? Oh, wow, okay, quite. Okay. But that would be just, for the visual material. Okay, right, Russia. Right, so environmental challenges. whenever I speak to anyone about environmental challenges in current Russia, many people tend to remember the old days of the Soviet Union and the environmental degradation of the former Soviet Union countries during the last years of the Soviet Union. That is mid-80s, late 80s. The situation has changed greatly since then, and one of the greatest transformation was about the fact that a lot of industry has come down as a result of economic downfall in the 90s, which on one hand led to the factor that many former industrial polluting factories got closed down, which led to actually improving of air quality and water quality and quality of soil in many regions across Russia. So that was, we can say, a somewhat positive impact of the economic downfall which took place in the 90s. However, as you see on this slide, so some of the old environmental challenges became less acute. However, some newer ones appeared. And among the new ones, those are the challenges which are mostly connected to consumption and environmental problems resulting from consumption, be it the waste issue or be it air pollution resulting from vehicles in large cities of Russia. And I would like to show you a very interesting visualization, which was, it's in Russian, but I'll explain like what everything means here. So that was a special report which was prepared by something like 100 of Russian scholars doing environmental studies. And that was a special report prepared shortly before the Year of Ecology. So 2017 was a so-called Year of Ecology in Russia. This is when many green topics came into the limelight of politicians, into the limelight of administration, into the limelight of general people, companies. So that was the year when they started speaking a lot about ecology, and well, basically they keep on doing it now. And we can see, according to this graph, that ever since the, like over the last few years and what has been happening ever since of the fall of the Soviet Union, the industrial emissions have been at first gradually going down, but then they kind of remained at the same level for the last few years. This is actually one of the major challenges, is that something which was achieved by a very, I would say, unsustainable policy of just bringing economy down, right? So there was a certain achievement, but after that, the question is like, how do we continue bringing those emissions further down? Likewise with motor vehicles, a significant drop, and then more or less remaining at the same level. So why did drop has happened? Because the vehicles got replaced with the new ones. Everyone who went to Russia in the 80s or 90s, and whoever goes to Russia now, can obviously see that the cars which are on the streets of Russia are mostly foreign cars, which are somewhat less polluting. And some of the cities are actually trying to introduce vehicle standards, like Moscow is probably will be the first one who will introduce very strict vehicle standards for downtown Moscow. On the other hand, the overall amount of vehicles continues growing, and this is like something which takes place all across Russia, whether you go to, like in most urban centers, whether it's Moscow, whether it's Krasnoyarsk, whether it's Vladivostok, traffic jams in the cities planned and constructed not for that amount of motor vehicles which are now out there on the streets. And here you see a few further statistics on, this is about water pollution and wastewater treatment. Once again, due to industry collapse, less pollution of water, but then very often in many cities all across Russia, wastewater treatment plants are either old or outdated. They need a lot of investment, also including household wastewater, and very often the money is not there. So yeah, once again, where to get the money from, how to invest them efficiently, how to get the amount of percentage of polluted waters down. Waste. I keep repeating it here. I mean, you see the way the waste is growing. So I keep repeating it here that whenever you are in any Russian city and you just stop anyone on the street and you ask him or her, what do you think is the environmental challenge in Russia #1? The answer you will get is waste. And this is something which people observe. This is something people read about. This is something which people worry about. And waste, meaning not literally waste not being taken out of the streets, because most of Russian cities look very clear, like, you know, the waste is being taken out. It's more about where is it being taken out and what happens there. Up until recently, more than 90% of all household waste has been taken to landfills. The area of landfills in Russia is, the total area of landfills in Russia is something around 1/5 of the area of all Russian nature reserves. It's like a huge area. The problem has been especially acute around Moscow. You know, Moscow is a multi-million city, around 20 million people, I think, there now. So Moscow produced 1/5 of all Russian household waste. And because Moscow is a region in its own, and Moscow is like a city and a region, Moscow cannot have any landfills on its territory. So most of Moscow waste has been taken out to the Moscow region, Moskovska Oblast, up until recently. And Moscow has been surrounded by the so-called circle of landfills. But the city is growing, there's new construction coming up, and people, more and more people, start living next to these landfills. And they're obviously not happy about it. They're not happy about the fact that, you know, drainage from landfills gets into groundwaters, that very often these landfills produce nasty odors, which also reach some part of Moscow. So what we had about a year ago is a massive protests of people from the Moscow region, that's Moskovska Oblast once again, against landfills. And then guess what happened? One of the protests got so massive that Vladimir Putin came there. He saw that and he said, okay, let's close this landfill, which they did. But what did it mean? It meant that all other landfills became even more challenged. And even further protests appeared. So now there's this really great challenge what to do with the household waste from Moscow. Now they're trying to reach deals with other regions of Russia to actually take it there. And the region which they found and which was happy about was Arkhangelsk. And but then the agreement which the government of Moscow reached with the government of Arkhangelsk, which is in the north of Russia, like if you from St. Petersburg go north, and north, you'll get to Arkhangelsk eventually. But then people were not happy about it. And so what it led to are once again massive protests in Arkhangelsk region against household waste from Moscow. I mean, that kind of system obviously needs a reform in its management. I'll get back to it later, but just, you know, to show to you why is waste such an important issue for Russia. Greenhouse gases. Once again, Russia is currently number 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter, following China, the US, European Union, if we count European Union as one entity, India. So Russia is number 5. Russia's greenhouse gas emissions have significantly went down in the 90s and 2000s. So in many ways, Russia has overfulfilled its obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. Over the last few years, Russia's greenhouse emissions have been more or less stable. Russia still has not ratified the Paris Agreement, but it's on the way to the ratification of the Paris Agreement, possibly this year. Forest fires. Once again, a number of factors. Forest fires are mostly an issue for forests in southern and central Siberia and the far east of Russia. This is where forests are drier than the ones you have at the northwestern part of the country, like, you know, St. Petersburg, Karelia, like their forests are more humid, so forest fires are very rare there. Forest fires, once again, a number of factors. Climate change being one of them. Siberia, southern Siberia gets more arid climate than before. Likewise to the Far East. But then also improper forest management and improper wood cutting, illegal loggings, mostly in southern Siberia and the Far East of Russia, and mostly with the purpose to take it all to China and sell it there. So that's another very important issue. If in the west of the country, so to say, especially in the northwest of the country, which is another very large forestry area, the forestry sector has really become more civilized, one can say, and gray or black loggings are truly very rare, and most of that forestry products are actually going to Scandinavia or other countries, like European markets. Then what's happening in forestry sector in the far east of Russia, that's more like very few people know actually what happens there. And there are also a lot of myths about it, like Chinese companies are coming and they're cutting down all our forests, so we will not have any taiga left in a few years. But then, yeah, there's also a lot of shady business taking place in that area. Yeah, I'll probably stay here. Right, so I've mentioned quite a few ones of the environmental challenges, and I think another very important factor to mention here is that yeah, visible and non-visible. I'll probably comment on that. So on one hand, you have all this official data which says which environmental problems are the most acute for Russia. On the other hand, you also have public perception of what are the most acute environmental challenges. And it's very often that urban environmental challenges will be more seen and will be perceived as more serious than the ones happening elsewhere. Because in Russia, urbanization is still growing. People keep moving to large cities, the so-called города-миллионники, so cities with the population of about 1 million of people. And that also brings up a whole new selection, a whole new set of environmental issues, mostly connected with an unsustainable urban development, which means more and more housing construction, more and more construction of high-rise houses. If you ever find yourself on the outskirts of any large Russian city, you would see how like, in Russian we say like mushrooms, right? They keep growing 20, 30, 40-storied houses. People move into cities need. But then, do we really get it as sustainable urban development? Is there really enough green zones? Is there really enough parks? What about roads? So all these issues are very urgent issues. And this is also where you have the majority of public environmental protests taking place, like tackling these issues. But I'll get back to it a bit later. But then, so that's why you would have a lot of urban environmental protests. But then as a comparison, you would have very little public awareness and also public protests about such an environmental issue as oil spills. Why? Because it mostly happens in the places where hardly anyone lives. And unless Greenpeace sends their helicopter there and will take a few aerial photos of the areas when oil place has taken place, you would not probably know about it, but you also would not probably worry about it, right? Because there are less people, hardly people at all living there. So that would be less of a public concern issue. Right, yeah, so public perception and reality. Yeah, so these are some of the environmental issues which are perceived as the most important and most acute environmental challenges. I think I've spoken on quite a few of them already. I will maybe only mention the last one, the environmental data. Now, this is something which has been an issue over the last 2 or 3 years, is the interest from residents of mostly large cities in Russia in environmental data. What is in the air that we breathe? What kind of water do we drink? Can we trust official statistics? Where do we get this data? Well, if we speak about Russian, wait a minute, getting it here. Okay, sorry. Yeah, it's here. So, yeah, that was, for example, one of the recent polls on the amount of people worried about environmental issues and estimating what the environmental situation in their city or their town has changed over the last few years. And you can see, so the red ones is the amount of people which say it got worse, and then this one hasn't changed at all, and this one, could have been, maybe improved. And this is also another interesting, there was like a very recent poll, maybe like a month ago, and this is an article in RBK which analyzes this poll. And I think right here we'll get to those are the most acute environmental problems which people speak about: waste, air quality, and then all other problems. So back to environmental data. The problem with environmental data is that there are a number of state or city-run monitoring systems, be it air quality, be it water quality, but it's very often that this information is either not available to the public, or doesn't look trustworthy to the public, or doesn't look understandable to the public. Even the city where I come from, St. Petersburg, which has a rather advanced air quality monitoring system, which was set up with the help of Finland, our western neighbor, so to say. It might look perfect on paper, however, the data which they get from various posts is only presented on the website of the local environmental committee as in form of long Excel tables, which even I need so much time to get through and actually understand what that means. So in many ways, it's quite often the case that the local authorities are not interested in making this information public, and also bringing this information and showing the real situation. It also, in many ways, comes from the factor that the way local authorities report to, say, federal authorities is that everything is all right? There's this push of showing the situation in a brighter mode, saying, it used to be super bad 10 years ago, and now we did this and this measures, we spent that and that money, also like money from the federal budget, and now the situation is so much better. So in a way, they're not really motivated to show the real situation, even though sometimes their reports actually are very honest. Even if you read, I would also have here the report from the Ministry of Environment, like the Federal Ministry of Environment in Russia. And they do this overall report on the environmental situation all across Russia, which is like a very thick document of something like 300 pages. And this is a split so this is like a more readable version of it. So that report would be very honest and very open and very critical. But then how many people read it? How many people take their decisions based on this data? Those are all remain to be open questions. So in a way, the whole link between having environmental data, making it accessible to public, doing something about it, communicating all these things to the public, listening to their opinion, is very often not there. So what happens? I will get back to it in a few minutes. So I mentioned all the major, some of the major environmental issues in Russia. So what is being done in the area of environmental policies and regulation? There are a number of ongoing federal environmental reforms taking place over the last 5 years, I think. And which means that the government, both the federal government and regional governments, do pay attention to the topic. They also realize how much it is more of an important topic for the general public now. And so they also understand how much environmental degradation and ineffective environmental management does harm Russia's economy, well-being of its citizens, and health of the citizens. And so there are a number of ongoing reforms taking place. You can see some of them. So waste management reform, the whole idea of the waste management reform is that we should maybe bring less of our household waste to landfills and develop recycling, but also build up incinerators. Incinerators have been a very contradictory issue in Russia for the last 2 years. Whenever there was an incineration investment project announced in the proximity of any city, there were very massive public protests against it, which led to the fact that Moscow canceled its plans to build an incinerator, St. Petersburg canceled its plans to build an incinerator. Now there's a second attempt to bring, again, more incinerators to Russia as part of the federal program, which is surprisingly called Чистая страна, clean country. Overall, there are something like 20 incineries due to be built. The money is coming from the federal budget to a federal-run operator, and there is also like all possible ways of, criticism for potential corruption in this scheme. Public protests against incineries continue. Citizens are also building up groups which are trying to sue local governments and, against this plan to build them. Interestingly, and that's also a very interesting aspect, the whole idea of incineration is also being supported by some international players. It's very often that you would have Japanese companies or Swiss companies or Swedish companies coming to Russia and trying to sell their incineration technologies to Russia. And the argument which they often have, take a look, in Vienna, there's an incinerator plant right in the middle of the city, and we are doing well. So why don't you build exactly the same incinerator next to Moscow? And this is where the problem of trust comes again, because then the citizens of the Moscow region tell you, well, the citizens of Vienna can be trusting their government on the percentage of dioxins which run out of the incinerators' pipes and get into the air, but will we be able to trust our authorities on that information? How will we actually know that it's harmless? How will we actually, can we actually be sure that that won't harm our health or the health of our children? So yeah, incineration is a thing to follow on Russia. Best available control technologies. This is something which has more to do with environmental regulation of polluting companies. So the idea is, up until now, the way pollution companies have been reporting and paying for environmental degradation is that any particular pollution factory would voluntarily write the emissions. Like they would say, like that year, because of this industrial process, we emitted so much of SO2, so much of NO2, so much of whatever, formaldehyde, whatever. And then, so they did it like voluntarily. So you can also think that sometimes they might have, told you not the whole truth about their activities. And whenever authorities wanted to check on them with the help of Rosprirotnadzor, which is the state-controlled environmental body, they would have to warn the company in advance. Meaning what? Some of the production lines have been closed before a check comes. Some of the production lines can be, some of the equipment for purifying of dangerous emissions can be turned on where it's not turned on normally. So you got all these mismanagement practices. And there were also cases like when a particular polluting factory, especially located and built next to a large urban settlement, would make most of the emissions in the nighttime. This is when you would have less of, for example, less of people being aware of this, or maybe the city authorities not measuring their air quality at that particular time. Though the so-called ночные выбросы, or night emissions, is quite an issue for many industrial Russian cities. And I think what's also important to mention is that most of these industrial cities, those cities in which right in the city or kind of very close to the city you would have polluting industries, they're mostly located in Siberia. They're mostly located in south of Siberia or south of the Ural region. So in most of Russia's large cities in European part of the country, be it Moscow, be it St. Petersburg, be it Nizhny Novgorod, be it Krasnodar or Rostov-on-Don, you would not find any industry in the city, almost none. So the air pollution in those cities would be coming from vehicles and motor vehicles. Yeah.
I just was wondering, the IU Bloomington here, if you go out at like 5 in the morning, or really early in the morning, you'd catch all this big coal. IU did it here with their coal thing for the longest time as well. It's a kind of a common practice. It's actually considered safer if you're going to have emissions to do it at night, but to do it to, of course, avoid emissions controls is the bad thing. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for bringing it up. And likewise with energy generation in Russia, most of European part of the country, urban European part of the country, would have their energy generation based on natural gas, which means their air quality is cleaner. Most of cities in southern Ural part of the country and south of Siberia would have most of its generation based on coal because they are not connected to the gas pipeline, which brings another factor in air pollution to the region. So the whole idea of the best available control technologies is to make up reference books for the best available and environmentally friendly control technologies available on the Russian market, and then motivate companies to start using them, so invest in them, by giving them tax benefits, by releasing them from any environmental payments for a number of years, and by overall motivating them financially and administratively to introduce these technologies. So that reform has been going on for the last 4 years, and it will take another 10 years to have it completed. Once again, there's a lot of criticism of that reform because it's very often that the reference books for the industry were written by the business industries associations. So like best available control technology reference book for coal industry was written by an association of the coal industry. And there are some industries, especially the ones who work a lot with international investors or customers, say pulp and paper industry. They were the ones who are doing relatively well, right? Because they sell most of they produce to Europe. If those are kind of large companies, right, like Elim or something similar, they would be doing relatively well in this, and their reference books would actually be much higher. But then, if it's a coal association of coal companies, you might not wait for such a great new standards. So there's a lot of talk about that. There's also a lot of talk say that for a city like Chelyabinsk or Krasnoyarsk, introducing best available control technologies might not be enough. So the government of Chelyabinsk, for example, they've offered to introduce another layer of environmental regulation, and that is begin distributing emission permits for companies, emission permits for polluting substances. Chelyabinsk is pushing for it. We'll see where we get. Yeah, national project ecology. Russia is fond of national projects. One national project is usually being substituted by another one. And I'll show you the, yeah, so that would be, sorry, it's in Russian again. So that would be the main, so in a way, this is a project for the next 6 years. Well, 2019, yeah, like next 5 years. And you see that in a way, this is like an overarching project for all issues from waste till air quality, water quality, and cleaning up of polluted rivers and lakes. And it's very often that pollution is still there from the late Soviet years. So there are quite a number of contaminated sites which have not really been purified up till then. And if anyone is interested in that, then I'll be happy to forward all this data and all this information about, you know, what is the budget, how much is going to be spent for what, and yeah. As I already mentioned, national projects, so like federal programs, sometimes they're also called Федеральная целевая программа or national projects. This is something very popular in Russian regulation. Not all of them function well. I'll bring you one example. There was, over the last 5 years, there was this recent federal program, Федеральная целевая программа, on the improvement of quality of environment of the Baikal Lake. Федеральная целевая программа по оздоровлению Байкала. A lot of money has been allocated, not much has been done. This is a great corruption case at the moment, and they're trying to think where the money went to. But yeah, so we'll see how this goes. Yeah, old contamination, and then there are also an ongoing reform of many other, like forestry code, wildlife protection, nature reserves. Speaking about wildlife, I don't know if you read it in the news, but there was this recent case of a number of various marine mammals who got stuck on the customs inspection in the far east of Russia. They were marine mammals who had to be taken to China. China is the largest buyer of live marine mammals from Russia. for aquariums, sea parks, and other kind of amusement purposes. And that is, once again, is the sector which is very often corrupt, there's a lot of mismanagement about it. There's a lot of mismanagement about the amount of quarters that the marine mammals, in which amounts can marine mammals be caught. But caught, I mean like as live creatures, and then sold elsewhere. So that is another sector where you have potentially quite a lot of corruption. Likewise, like another present environmental issue is raptor birds, which are being sold to the Middle East. This is also something which is an issue for Russia and Ukraine. Quite a lot of them are being smuggled through shady custom channels. And yeah, so if we speak about wildlife issues and wildlife actually being smuggled to other parts of the world, so that would be the birds and then marine mammals to China, because that's like a really big issue. Nature reserves. Russia is, as many other countries, is proud of its nature reserves, but it also needs a lot of money for the support of these nature reserves, because many of them are very hard to reach, very hard to get to. So the wording which you often hear from the Ministry of Natural Resources is that we need to find a way for these nature reserves to actually start generating money, maybe from environmentally friendly tourism. So let's develop environmentally friendly tourism. And then you have all the environmentalists who come in and they say, but look, but it's very often what you mean is actually building up a ski resort somewhere down there. And then through corruption connections, companies which are close to the government or to the local government will just start making most of money about it by also destroying local ecosystems of the nature reserves. So there's an ongoing discussion. Nature reserves, very large territories, sometimes very wild, very hard to reach. Like some of them are close to where people can easily reach them, but like the Siberian ones, especially located in central and northern Siberia, you could only really reach them by helicopters or by planes, and that costs a lot for regular people to go there and enjoy them. So where can we get the money for them? Will it lead to corruption? Will it actually lead to the destruction of the system? Ongoing discussion again. Now, third topic of our talk today. What does it mean for the general public? For which particular issues is general public getting engaged in environmental causes? What are the roots of the new environmental movements and environmental campaigns in Russia? Once again, I'll take a slight historical approach for that. Yeah, thank you. After the fall of the Soviet Union, quite a lot of international green groups came to work in Russia. Be it the Greenpeace, be it the WWF, be it the IFA, be it many others. Many more local environmental groups in Russia have been supported by the Western donors, be it UN money, be it also country money. US aid also contributed a lot to development of civil society in Russia, including environmental groups. With the exception of the foreign agent law and subsequent growing pressure on civil society groups, more and more of these groups found it difficult to continue working as they did. Quite a few of them, I would say, like environmental groups were not among the first three most evil groups from the point of view of the Russian government. The three most evil would still be probably groups who are doing election watching, and LGBT groups, and human rights groups in general. But many of the environmental groups still got under attack. Interestingly, mostly groups from the regions of Russia, mostly not environmental groups from St. Petersburg or Moscow, but groups from the so-called other regions of Russia. And which led to the fact that many of them closed down their activity, or got re-registered as companies, or just dismantled themselves as organizations and became just an initiative or grassroots group working on particular cases. So you would have, so to say, this trend, which is like a trend number one. Saying this, I still should note that both Greenpeace Russia and WWF Russia remain to be the most powerful groups in the country. they're the ones who find themselves or position themselves not as protest action groups, but more of someone in between an NGO and a think tank. For, say, a case and example is WWF Russia, you might be having something like 70 or 100 people working for them in Moscow. And quite a lot of these are experts of very high quality, people who worked for the government before, scientists, and those are the people who actually consult Russian government on international environmental issues or consult Russian government on environmental legislation. So in many ways, they do function as experts. And likewise with Greenpeace, right? Greenpeace in Russia doesn't only attack oil rigs, or they do a lot of this expert and analytical work. But then, what we have been seeing over the last few years is an amazing growth in local grassroots environmental initiatives, which very often remain unregistered, so they don't register themselves as NGO. They remain to be in an initiative, grassroots group. They wouldn't have an office. They would have a website. I'll show you one of this. This is for example, an association of all groups fighting for the air quality and water quality in Moscow and Moscow region, so around Moscow. And they've been very powerful. They're the ones who, they don't have people who work there permanently, like staff workers. So all these people would be volunteers. All these people would be someone who has a daily job and then does something after that for a cause like this. They also here, they keep mentioning that it's mostly volunteer activity and they are not financed by anyone. I think it's very important for them to bring this issue in, that they are not financed by any foreign donors, by any companies or whatever. So say a recent campaign which this group did was to set up a crowdfunding campaign on financing of water tests and groundwater tests in a particular neighborhood in the Moscow region. And yeah, they call it Народный контроль, so people's control. And yeah, so that was it. They were trying, they were doing water tests and also soil tests next to the incinerator which has been working in Moscow for a number of years. So that kind of group, they would also go and sue polluters. They would also go and sue local administration. I mean, it's more of a large city thing, but you would get similar groups in all the major Russian cities gradually. I mean, this was probably more of a Moscow thing first, but then, yeah, also all other cities. What I think is very important for such groups is that they have enough manpower. These people who are engaging for this cause have enough free time, because time is a crucial thing. They have enough of affordable resources, which means they are relatively, well, it probably be like lower middle class people who are willing to spend some of their time for a good cause for free, and even have some of the money which they are willing to invest into something which they think is a common good. And these groups are still learning a lot. How to make a campaign, how to start a social media campaign, because mostly they communicate a lot through social media. They do mobilization of social media. How do you work on a door-to-door campaign? How do you work with journalists? How do you go to courts? Very often they would cooperate with someone like Greenpeace, like they would ask Greenpeace to support their cause, right? Like they're not completely antagonists. But however, for them, it's crucially important to say that we are not any agents of any potential foreign influence or whatever influence, that they remain independent. And in that way, many similar groups want to differentiate themselves from the so-called traditional NGOs. They even wouldn't call themselves an NGO. So yeah, quite a lot of these groups are so-called not in my backyard group. So once they win after a particular case, they dismantle. And they honestly don't worry about what happens in other places. So if they win against the pollution factory or against a new infrastructure plan to build something nasty in their neighborhood, they would stop. And if it's built elsewhere, it's someone else's responsibility to fight against it. Yeah, so what also, but then, like, these groups are scattered. But what I've been noticing over the last few years is that many of them have been trying to build associations. In Moscow, there have been quite a few campaigns, like more than 20 campaigns for the protection of the local parks. Meaning keeping the parks and not allowing new 20-story housing building to appear there. And last year they set up an association of this group because they also see the limits of what they do with what they do. They are willing to get more political, even though they don't call it political, because they are kind of cynical of the politics. They don't want to deal with politics, but it's still, they want to get political. They want to be present in общественные советы, which are like civic chambers of the local administration. They want to push for something. They are trying to get more professional, and that's a very interesting trend, I find. This is like my own little classification of this group, which I'm trying to sustain. And I tend to divide them into three major groups. So the first one would be protest groups, usually against a particular cause, be it against incendiary, be it against potential plans to build new housing and destroy your local green area, be it a group against an existing polluting industry. Then DIY groups. Oh my God, it's DIY, sorry, I missed the letters. Do-it-yourself groups. So those groups are the ones who are trying to substitute non-existent straight infrastructure, for example, for recycling. Like in most Russian cities, you would not find city-provided opportunities for recycling. So what you have groups like Раздельный сбор. Раздельный сбор has probably been the most powerful one, and it's also nationwide, but it always functioned at the city level. So they are the ones who set up, this is from St. Petersburg, who set up collection points for separately selected trash. And they encourage people to do it at home and then bring it there maybe once a week or once a month. And then they are the ones who would actually take them to recycling facilities, will make some money on it, and by this pay for their costs and pay for whatever. But overall, they're also growing. They started doing this, but now they do much more. They also do lobby for more recycling, supported of recycling facilities, of recycling business. They are fighting against incineraries. They are getting into a network, grassroots civil society initiatives, working with an issue of recycling and waste in general, and they're really becoming very powerful. And they are the ones who also sometimes launch crowdfunding campaigns and successful crowdfunding campaigns. They're the ones who people trust. They're the ones who people know and people trust. So you have them, and then the third group, I call them watchdogs or civic monitoring groups. They come in two categories. The first category would be a group which would follow public spending on environment or on communal services, ЖКХ, or on urban issues in cities. A good example of that is Красивый Петербург, which is translated as beautiful St. Petersburg. That's one, again, grassroots group, non-registered, not financed by anyone, only crowdfunding. What they are doing is that they're taking people's complaints about certain things, like, it can be urban issues, mostly urban or environmental issues. And they would try to actually bring it to the authorities and demand from authorities that they do something about it. And blame them and shame them and launch campaigns. On one hand, they're trying to be a pain in the foot. On the other hand, they are also someone who are trying to, establish relationships with authorities. Not only demanding, but also saying, look, we know how to do it. Listen to us. So, and similar groups have been set up in many cities across Russia. So, yeah, they're very popular on, so they also track, who is in power, what did they spend money on, who is responsible. Like this winter, we've had, surprise, surprise, a lot of snow in St. Petersburg. And there's been all over national news how badly the city is cleaned, especially in comparison to Moscow. I have all these pictures where I show women walking up in their, fancy shoes on the streets of Moscow, and people hardly making it through the streets of St. Petersburg with the snow mountains as high as this. And so they've been also kind of trying to push and find out where the money is going, where our public money is going to. So yeah, and then other kind of this watchdog groups is directly connected with an issue of environmental data. And that's a very interesting new trend. So people not trusting or not having access or not understanding environmental data start setting up their own environmental air, like civic air quality monitoring systems. Mostly in the regions where air quality is a very big issue, and mostly where it's connected to industry or coal generation. A case and example is Krasnoyarsk, city in Siberia, and the project is called Krasnoyarsk Neba. And the idea was to buy up a number of easy-to-use air quality monitoring systems, distribute them all across city, and put this data on a map in real time, and then make it accessible to people in the city. This has been a very successful project. Crowdfunded, done by activists, supported by activists, something that local activists use in their communication with the local authorities. So they were the ones who made themselves important and listened to by launching this project. And this is an amazing project. Similar one has been launched in Chelyabinsk, which is called Chelyabinsk Dyshi, Chelyabinsk Breathe. And you see here all the points, and yeah, you can also help the project, and yeah. So, and they're very effective in social media, all across the social media. They're something that people trust, people understand how it works, people also understand that they can participate in it, and yeah, so you would get to see this. So civic or citizen-led air quality monitoring systems. Yeah, I'll just show you a few. There are also further ones coming. There's also coming up one in Moscow, one in Nizhny Novgorod, and one, but mostly it's an issue for industrial cities, right, where air pollution is very acute. So we would have this. Now, almost running out of time, so yeah, just little classification. Now, so these groups have a number of strengths and a number of weaknesses. Their strength is that they often position themselves as something which truly originated from grassroots and not come from elsewhere, no matter where. They're the ones who tend to have public support, and a lot of public support, also in financial, but also in financial terms, but also in terms of people actually willing to dedicate their time to take part in these groups. They are still somewhat limited in the scope of activity they can take. They're still somewhat limited in their professional development, but they are trying to build up their own capacity. They're trying to become more important, and they're thinking, how can they become more important and more influential, at the same time not coming under potential attack or pressure from the local authorities. So they're always trying to balance in between, like trying to be more influential, but also they're not trying to be fully oppositional. They're very cautious about anything which can be described as political in Russia, because this is very, very often a bad word for them. They will think twice before cooperating with Navalny and his people, or any other potentially oppositional forces. Some of them do, some of them don't. It's an ongoing discussion. Some of them now have set up their candidates for the new governor of St. Petersburg. Like the guy who set up Красивый Петербург will be one of the candidates in the coming up elections in St. Petersburg in September. So yeah, an issue of scaling up. How can they, build their activities up? Quite a few researchers call them the basis of the new civil society in Russia. Also seeing their limitations, the ones they have. And once again, speaking about topics, it's either mostly environmental or urban topics, so one of these two. So we'll see where it gets us to. We'll see where these groups find themselves in the next few years, but over the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, they've been really a very interesting new power in Russian civil society context, in a landscape of political trends in Russia and social political trends in Russia. Before I finish, I will just show you, so there's this online media, you can call it, but it's both a media and an activist network, which is called the Activatica, which is trying to track all of these initiatives, write about them, and give them a platform to speak. As it's quite often, especially if those groups come not from St. Petersburg or Moscow or Krasnoyarsk, but smaller places, they find it very hard to reach to traditional media because local media can be totally under control from the local governments. So they either do their own PR in Vkontakte, in Facebook, on other platforms. Telegram is also getting more important. Or they also use these websites, which is kind of trying to report about their cases. Or it's very often that they write here themselves. It's like a platform where any regional group can write about what they do, call up for support, call up for possible association with other groups. And yeah, and there are, like, this is probably would be resource number 1, which will tell you, she'll give you the whole picture about where those groups get together. I would probably stop here. I've already ran out a bit of my time, I believe, but we still have half an hour for questions. Thank you so much for your patience and patience. And yeah, I'm open to questions, comments. Yes, I think we'll start here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, really interesting and really the navigation of slides are really amazing. Thank you. And no industrial activity or no industrial plant means no environmental pollution, that means no people in development. So it is one of the things. But anyway, it is nice. So right to know information. We already developed one act that people have the right to know information, public data especially. So this is one of the sad things in Russian context, I don't know why, but it was strong, this group is there. But one question is, Russia has a lot of war weapons, especially nuclear weapons, tanks are there. So where their waste, the nuclear waste they dispose, is one thing. And you say that the waste now they put it far distance area, say for example, Honduras. So it is far distance, I think. So how they carry that is one kind of cost involvement as well as a far distance pollution also there. So these are the things very interesting. But I want to know especially what the nuclear atom waste are they putting. This is very important thing. Now in nuclear plant, you know, the government will be sad news that a lot of problems are there.
Right, well, I'll start up with a nuclear question. Most of Russia's nuclear facilities are located in European part of Russia, so before Urals. There's only one beyond Urals, around Tomsk, but most of nuclear capacity is in European part of Russia. Overall, nuclear accounts for around 15% of Russia's energy generation. It's not set up to grow significantly over the next few years. Some of the reactors will come out of work, some new ones will be added. And so in a way, every nuclear plant is a facility with a few reactors. So they will close some of the reactors and some of the new reactors will come into power. In most cases, nuclear plants are operated by the state nuclear company, which is called Rosatom, and which has been very successful in PR and in dealing with the local residents of the area where nuclear plants are affected. And they've also been very successful in establishing social infrastructure for the people who live in proximity of the nuclear plants. Back in the Soviet years, you would have the so-called closed cities, which were very often cities next to the nuclear plant, where engineers and everyone working for the nuclear plant would live. So these cities are still having the reputation of very high quality of life. You would have the best kindergartens, you would have the best public schools, you would have the best hospitals, you would have, like, you know, the best of everything. So in a way, it is prestigious to work. Which also builds to the fact that public anti-nuclear campaigns are almost non-existent in Russia. There are a number of NGOs which work and which are trying to bring information out that, you know, nuclear is not as safe as Rosatom will tell you. And there's a whole issue with nuclear waste. So Russia currently has, I think, one working location site for the nuclear waste, not far from Krasnoyarsk. And there's another one being built for the nuclear waste. But these location sites where they will keep nuclear waste, they are located rather far from human settlements. And Russia has also been buying, not buying, but like countries like Germany or France or Holland have been paying Russia to take their used nuclear fuel and also their nuclear waste to bury it in the sites. So Russia has been doing it up until recently. Now they're kind of trying to negotiate a new deal. So like I have to follow up on that if they're still doing it. But yeah. So yeah, the number of groups working on kind of bring public awareness to the fact that nuclear energy might not be as safe as it seems. But these groups, they are more kind of professional groups. They're more like professional NGO people. I cannot say they get a lot of public support. And they're also the ones who come under attack from the government. So most of them have been announced and declared to be foreign agents. Quite a few of them are still in courts against the state or against the Ministry of Justice. And yeah, so the nuclear thing is this. What was your other question, sorry?
The waste transportation.
So the idea is to transport it by railroad, and then the Russian railroads is due to give very favorable rates for the government of Moscow to transport it to Arkhangelsk region. And also the idea is that you would first press all of that very tightly, press all of the household waste very tightly in Moscow already, and then load it into trains, and then bring it with the trains to Arkhangelsk. So that's the plans. And it seems to be working financially well. Moscow has been trying to reach deal with quite a number of regions in Central Asia, Central Russia, from Yaroslavskaya Oblast till Kaluga to bring their waste there. So it really became a bit notorious, and there were all these public campaigns against, we don't want Moscow waste. And you also have to understand that it also comes in a way that Moscow is the wealthiest city in Russia. Also the city which many people from other regions dislike for being so wealthy and for spending so much time on themselves. And now as Moscow is trying to take its waste out to these regions, it's even more controversial. So it all comes with these issues. But shortly speaking, railroad transportation. Because Russia has a very developed railroad network. And I think RZD is once again a state-run company. And I think they've agreed with the government of Moscow to provide favorable tariffs for the transportation.
The incineration system, you say that it is far away from the neighborhood, or it is within some neighborhoods?
No, it's not in the neighborhoods, no. Okay. Yes, please.
There's a whole gigantic or whole large section in Russia which is as polluted as Chernobyl and as polluted as the Japan site. So their nuclear pollution is really horrible. And around the world, if you're trying to cool down the waste and you're not doing it in individual separate cold storage, but you're using storage which requires electricity, all it takes is a cutoff of electricity and you can have a meltdown. And with just all that means is a ton of release of things. So I understand his thought. My small question actually was right when I came in, because I finally got here. You were talking about incinerator.
Mm-hmm.
Were you talking about? Were they talking about is the Vienna incinerator a plasma incinerator where there's no emissions? It reduces the most toxic things to inert. Those are the golden ones that don't cause the emissions. Is that the one that?
They were speaking about technology. They are now considering a number of technologies. It's still not, there's still not a final choice which technology will actually be used. And also for various regions, it can be various technologies. So it's not like one technology. They are in talks with a number of international companies actually producing incinerators. And I know that potentially companies from Japan, Austria, Sweden, Finland are very much interested in supplying Russia with this technology. So yeah, not final. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. What a wonderful overview of both the problems and the hopes for improvements in the environmental situation in Russia. I'm really very interested in what you said about the grassroots movement, and I have a couple of questions about that. One, is there any kind of pattern in terms of who's taking part in these movements? I mean, so far as age, level of education, professions, things of that sort, basic sort of demographic data. And then my second question is, you made a very good point, I think, in saying that these groups tend to avoid anything that suggests active interference in the political system. But is there any overlap, say, between these environmentally focused groups and then groups focused on sort of cultural preservation, like some of the things that have been happening in St. Petersburg with the St. Isaac's Cathedral, the Gazprom tower construction, and the like?
Right. Thank you for your questions. So pattern. Well, in order to answer your question really professionally, I would probably should have, done a thorough study of these groups. But I can just share my impressions, right? The ones I get. So those would be mostly people from large urban areas, between 20 and 60, maybe more 30 and 60. No gender prevalence, like mixed, both men and women. You would call them, lower middle class. You would also, people, I would say, many of these groups would have people who are not working full day, right? Who come from professions where you don't actually have to be in the office. Who have flexible working hours and can dedicate some of their time to a good cause. Right, and engage for a good cause. Quite a lot of these people are families with children, because this is, when they're worried about the health of their children. Interestingly, I mean, it can probably be, sound a bit off topic, but still, I was a few times in Poland last year because of the upcoming climate conference, which was in Katowice, Poland. And interestingly, in Poland, you have very similar groups coming to life with the cause of fighting against smoke in Polish cities, right, which results from coal generation. And there, it's called Polski Alarm Smogowy, and there are all these groups across all large Polish towns, and we met with the groups in Warsaw. And I remember that there was a very kind of ambitious guy who was like probably around 40. And he did strike me as someone I could also see in Moscow. So it's kind of, in a way, young, ambitious people willing to have more control of their living environment. People who probably already have some of their basics covered. And they want to, on one hand, they want to have more information about what's around them. They want to have more influence on that. And they are also willing to demand more from the city authorities to do about it, or companies, energy companies supplying it. Interestingly, they don't go to Greenpeace for that. They set up their own groups. And in case of Poland, that's also like it's public-led air quality monitoring system. And then based on that data, they actually do approach city government and demand particular actions. So I don't know if it gives you a picture, but my understanding would be that. And did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did. And just a side note about the monitoring thing. When you're talking about it, I couldn't help but thinking back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s in the Soviet Union, when a very, very, very small group of people actually did try to do something similar, but in terms of the legal system, those that kept the Chronika текущих событий, yeah, the chronicle of current events. So a kind of independent monitoring system,
Oh, how interesting.
similar to what is being done with those air quality monitoring systems.
Now, second question, getting political and whether they all...
The cultural preservation.
The cultural preservation
Yeah.
groups. Yeah, you're right saying that the cultural or historical heritage preservation groups have been very active, predominantly in Moscow, like Arkhnadzor and St. Petersburg, with kind of similar structures. This group, the St. Isaac's campaign or the Gazprom Tower campaign, I'll probably even put them aside because they proved out to be really massive. And those were the campaigns where many civil society groups and also political powers joined, you know, for a big course. Maybe we should comment about that for the audience, right? So the Gazprom Tower was that Gazprom is bringing its headquarters to St. Petersburg. And there were plans to build up a high-rise tower very close to downtown St. Petersburg. And there was this public campaign a few years ago against it. And as a result of this campaign, Gazprom took a decision not to build towers so close to downtown, but build it up further out of the city, you know, closer to the sea, to the Gulf of Finland. And another campaign was St. Isaac's Cathedral. Those of you who have been to St. Petersburg saw St. Isaac's, and St. Isaac's up until recently functioned as a museum and was kind of run by the Ministry of Culture and functioned predominantly as a museum and less so with church, only for like big church holidays. So there was all these ideas and even decision making to give it back to the church. And that once again proved a massive campaign, protest campaign in St. Petersburg, which I think, according to the latest news, also proved to be successful. But those particular campaigns were the ones who really got everyone together, like literally everyone together. I cannot think of any such similar campaigns. Overall, I would say these groups, like, they know each other, they talk to each other, but unless they have a common cause for which they would cooperate, they wouldn't do that. These new environmental groups, they would rather go to someone like WWF or Greenpeace and ask them to help them with PR or legal consultation, because this is very often what is needed. And they would also go slightly different routes, you know, who to lobby, who to influence. So they're not antagonistic, but I don't see a lot of cooperation in between them.
Oh my God. I wanted to thank you also for your talk, echoing Mark. Amazingly informative. I mean, that you can assemble all of this information, and it's just super important. But I mean, isn't it kind of implicit in the answer to Mark's question that the grassroots environmental groups also seem to be, definitionally, to be IT and social media savvy? So they've sort of self-selected for that. In a sense, you know, that's maybe one of the commonalities, perhaps, you know, of the activist group. I can't say because I'm not directly familiar, but it's just a thought. And that's also kind of interesting. We heard a speaker last week who was great from Moscow, who came in by teleconference. And she was talking about patriotic education in Russia and how it's actually growing again by leaps and bounds. But it's not coming from a top-down model. It's actually the educational system just sort of starting to echo the Soviet survivals of this kind of education. And it too is undirected and sort of self-organizing. So it's interesting to see these two overlapping strains in a prospective Russian civil space. You know, one is the Soviet survival sort of organizing itself in the educational system in terms of patriotic education. It's not coming from the central government. And then the other is this sort of more global model of people self-organizing to reach pressing immediate environmental concerns in their neighborhood. So anyway, fascinating to better understand this, because it's certainly not immediately apparent to an outside observer. So you could say in a sense, that, sort of tongue-in-cheek, Russia's kind of evolving to the tragedy of the commons, in the Western model. But I have a specific question also, which is, it's a topic here in the Midwest, and the agricultural contamination of groundwater here, because the corporate agricultural model is a continuing topic, and it's only getting, I don't believe anyone thinks it's really contained, it's probably getting worse. And is that as much of a concern within European or Asian Russia?
Right. Thank you for your feedback, and also thank you for your questions. Well, I'll comment on a few of them. IT, social media, service, yeah, you're totally right. These groups seem to be very professional with everything they do on social media campaigning, attracting support. They know how to deal with it, and they also learn from each other. They look at each other, they look at everyone else is doing, what works, what doesn't work. They also often discuss it with each other. They ask it like, did you try petitioning with someone, I don't know, like change.org or whatever, did it work? Did it not work? How do you do it more efficiently? How do you do, they exchange information, they do reposts from each of the groups. So in a way, very often they do function as a network. I mean, within specific region, right? So a group from Krasnoyarsk wouldn't be doing it with a group from Nizhny Novgorod, but they are all based around Nizhny Novgorod, around. They do a lot to support each other in that. Patriotic education, I would know far less about it, but I might bring another argument, but also like following your idea, is that like many of the groups I've been telling you about, they are kind of perceived as the, so to say, good groups and public good groups. But there are also other groups being built in Russia, which might not be perceived as the good groups by those guys. Say, in particular urban context, this can be an informal associations of car drivers who could be protesting higher emission standards or higher parking rules, for which the environmental groups would be pushing. And this is where you see, tragedy of interest, tragedy of commons appearing, right? So who is pushing for what and on which grounds? But you see all kinds of these groups growing up, and this is a very interesting, also the way they talk to each other, the way they kind of lobby against each other, the way they interact with each other. Like groups fighting for good quality grass and trees in the city would not be fond of a group of car drivers who want to be allowed to park in the green areas in the city. And both of them are aware of each other, and both of them are these new roots of the so-called new civil society. Now, back to agricultural contamination. In the US kind of sense, industrial agriculture in Russia is only really present in the south of Russia. South of Russia meaning, Rostov, Krasnodar, and then everything below. The rest of the country you cannot hardly it's not to the level. I mean, there can be, like say, most of central Russia and like northwestern Russia, you would have animal stock, but you would not have plant agriculture or fruits or vegetables or wheat or rice. So that would be more of a regional issue for the south of Russia. And this is where it's getting more important. Say runoffs from rice fields containing pesticides and herbicides into groundwaters. This is slowly becoming a more important issue in the south. However, traditionally, south of Russia has been somewhat more conservative than many other regions, including more than Siberia in any way. So in a way, and you would have, you'd still see less of these groups appearing there. But it is slowly becoming an issue. Runoff from agricultural fields or waste from animal farms. But that also once again goes back to an issue visible, not visible, and perceivable, not perceivable. Say, if you speak about St. Petersburg, most of the Leningrad region, which is a region around St. Petersburg, has very developed animal breeding economy. But most of the farms would be so far away from any large concentration of people living there. People would just not be aware, even if there are runoffs of waste from these farms. it would not be seen, it would not be perceived, it would not be something which they are influenced with. So that's why you almost have no campaigns about it, because it's not visible. Because of the, it's kind of, the Anglo region is a very large region, and like area is huge, and you don't have, population tend to be more concentrated in cities where you wouldn't have that. And then if it's a farm, then, 10s or 20, many miles around it, you would not have anyone living. So it's, But south of Russia could potentially become more an issue. I actually know a few activists from south of Russia who've been fighting with this issue for years. His name is Valery Brinych. He's someone who goes around, sues pig farms, and he doesn't have a very wide support network yet, but I think this topic might come eventually. But I foresee it as more regional based due to the structure of Russian agriculture. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for a great lecture. It was really great to see and hear it. Well, I just wanted to add something because it's really kind of a thing that, is in my interest, and like, with my life experience, it's kind of really close to me. Because I'm originally from Omsk, and it's one of the most polluted cities in the whole Russia, and it also has a population of over 1 million people, and so it's just like there's so many plants and factories and just industrial complex of the city and like all around it that basically the pollution is just for the person who lived there, it's just insane, because when you move to Moscow, you're like, oh my god, I can finally breathe, And there were some cases, and especially the past years, where it's the notorious black snow, which is basically when there's a snowfall, and the snow that ends up on the ground is basically the color of this carpet, only it's like gray. And even if it seems to be like white, you look at it closely and there are like black particles in it. So and it's all about it's also about the topic of information and where people get it and how they get it, because the authorities, after all this happens, they tend to say, oh, it's just fine, the level of emissions is not high enough for us to stop it. And everybody who can see it obviously realizes that, well, it's not the case. It's obviously way higher than it should be. But nobody does anything about it. And also, the risk of getting cancer in this city is like really high also, because, well, my grandfather and grandmother used to live in this part of city where the risk is like almost the highest in the whole region. And lived there for like 50 years, and it's not really visible when you walk in there, because it's not like you walk from one part of the city to the other and suddenly it's like a zombie land. It's not that, it's not visible, but the consequences are just insane. And the thing is, and it's quite dangerous actually, that people, especially the young ones who were born here, in Omsk, and who lived like this all their life and who witnessed all of that, they tend to think that this is okay, that this is how it should be, and that, well, okay, it's bad, but what can we do about it? And it's really like, I feel like it's not only about ecology in Russia. I feel it's like about everything, including politics, including, well, everything, basically. And I actually didn't look up the activist groups, and I'm gonna look this up because it's really important, but I feel like this is the situation that needs to be addressed, more or less.
Right. Well, thank you so much for bringing this very particular example from one of the South Siberian cities. I think it's also, it gives us a very vivid picture what the situation is there like. In reply to this, I wanted to show you, I just got it yesterday, I think, And that's a new public initiative and like an action group which unites people from various cities in, I think in Siberia and Ural. Oh no, this is Novokuznetsk. No, that's Novokuznetsk. Yeah, no, here you see quite a lot of, wait a minute. Novokuznetsk, Chelyabinsk, Norilsk, Krasnoyarsk, Omsk. So this is like a cross-city group from the most polluted cities in Russia, most industrially polluted cities in Russia, from central Russia, northwest, Ural, and South Siberia. And now these groups, this actually been very new, I didn't know much about it. These groups are trying to bring their efforts together and to see what they can do and how they can help each other. This is super new, but that also corresponds with the whole idea that these groups might eventually come up together into sort of informal association and trying to support each other and kind of, build capacity of each other and maybe build up a larger lobby group. So Omsk is there. Let's take a look then. Who is there from Omsk? Actually, I've never met anyone, any representatives of similar environmental groups from Omsk. Omsk has been somehow very quiet with that respect. Like Chelyabinsk is very active, Krasnoyarsk is very active. Now Novokuznetsk, which is a big coal center in Russia, has also been getting more active recently. Norilsk has been very quiet up until recently. Bratsk, yeah. So there you have new regions coming up. Let's see.
It's consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks everyone for coming to the talk today, and let's thank our speaker, Angelina Davidova. Having you at IU this week. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your time this morning. And if you're willing to stay in touch, I'll be happy to share my contacts, and if you have any further questions, yeah, you're welcome to reach out. Thank you.